Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie Flinchbaugh, host of People Solve Problems, and today we have Dr. Wendy Smith as our guest today. Wendy, how are you?
Great to be here. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, glad to have you. I'm excited about this. So, Dr. Wendy Smith is a professor at the University of Delaware, winner of the Thinker 50 Breakthrough Idea Award, which is pretty cool, and author of Both and Thinking, which is a very compelling title. Without even knowing what we're talking about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I have, although those in listening won't hear it, my Kindle with with your, it's where I read most of my books these days, with your book on it. So thanks for coming on and talking about both and thinking. So why don't you just explain us a little bit about what both and thinking is and maybe just how it's relevant to everyday problem solvers.
Yeah, and then again, thanks for having me. Here's the bottom line, in case people don't get through the full podcast. We all face tensions, challenges, competing demands. We face them in our personal lives. We face them in our teams, and we face them in our leadership of teams, our strategic leadership of organizations. We definitely face opposing pressures, competing demands, oppositional ideas in our society and our politics. And when I say we, it's myself and my co-author, Mary Ann Lewis, who I've been working together with for years. What we argue is that it's not if we face these tensions, but how. And the typical way that we all tend to address competing demands is to see them as a dilemma, a trade-off, an either or, where we have to make a choice between them. And we find that approach is what we say limited at best and detrimental at worst. It minimizes creativity, and often it creates increased problems and challenges. And so we invite people instead to understand the different structure of the problem and offer a different approach through the both and, seeing the underlying paradox and finding a different way to address our challenges.
It's a great summary, and I think a compelling reason why this matters. There's a quote from the movie or the show West Wing, which is always one of my favorites, where President Bartlett says there's very few instances where there's an absolute right and an absolute wrong, and most of those days involve body counts. The rest is nuance. The rest is tension and trade-offs and things like that. So that's where we live. We live in that space. So let me first ask you, because you kind of there's a lot of sort of emotional friction around some of those challenges. Certainly the way you framed it. So how much about moving through this into a different way of thinking about it? How much of is it psychological, or is it only about the tool sets that we have?
Well, Jamie, I'll just stop you right there and say I am allergic to the or. So as soon as you ask the question as an or, that's the invitation to jump in. It's a little bit of an intellectual hazard, which is that's not an either or. It's not an either or has become a bit of a mantra. So one bottom line actually is we need to be thoughtful about the structure of the questions we ask, how we frame our questions. As we think about these tensions. So, but to be less cavalier, I think underlying what you're asking is what informs how, so a big question about this both and is, is it sort of about the nature of the problem? There are some problems that are either or and some are both and, or is it about how we see the problem, how we frame it, how we cognitively think about it? It's a little bit of the if a tree falls in the woods kind of problem. Is it about the sounds of the tree falling, or is it about the person who hears the tree? And indeed, we suggest that is a both, one of both and. One of the things and again, not to be cute about it, but indeed, we would argue that the structure of our world, our systems, our teams, our way of being in the world is inherently, and we use the word paradoxical, meaning that there are these opposing, that we experience tensions as dilemmas, these pressures in either or, and underlying these pressures are these paradoxical, interwoven, interdependent conflicts. So just by, but as an example, I know that many of your listeners are executives or leaders, people thinking about manufacturing, thinking about product development, thinking about, a key tension in that space, for example, is the tension between, quality and either quality and quantity, or time and
Right.
time and quality.
Right.
And that is an ongoing trade-off, which is, am I going to do this faster? Or am I going to do it better? And what we would argue is that embedded within a tension like that in the long term, over time, the more effective, better quality that you do something, the faster you can ultimately do it. Now, in the moment, it feels like you're going to say, am I spending more time doing and being more perfectionist or improve the quality of something, or am I just going to get it out and get it moving? But over time, what we know is that improved quality and improved product, viability leads to decreased time. Now, so underlying that momentary trade-off is this inherent interwoven paradoxical relationship. Now, the question is, well, how do people see it? And can people reframe the question to think about that longer-term relationship and come up with a better solution in the moment to accommodate both quality and time, or whatever other tension you want to talk through?
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you leveraged my question to make the point, because it really makes the point. This isn't something like, okay, next Tuesday I have to plan some time to do some both and thinking.
Right.
It kind of becomes an always on mindset, always on skill set that can at any moment either inhibit you or enable you to move forward. And those are the most powerful, but also the hardest to build. And so do you go through moments of building very deliberate practice with both and thinking, and that builds up the ability to rethink in an always on mode? Or are there tricks to sort of jump to always on? Is it a combination of the two? How do they build the practice?
Yeah. Yes, and Jamie. Yes, and both and. Yes. So yes, it's both changing our habits in the moment and thinking about the longer term structures that we have around us. And one of the reasons we wrote Both and Thinking, the book, is because both myself and Marianne Lewis, my co-author, are academics. We've been studying this for the last 25 years. We have an incredible community of scholars that have advanced and developed these ideas. And we wanted to figure out how to bring a broad set of ideas to make them accessible to people. And so what we did was we brought together these ideas and we say, look, we offer up a central framework in the book that says, look, there's 4 different buckets of tools, sets of tools that help to advance both and thinking overall. And we name those buckets very conveniently through a model that took us a long time to come to, a mnemonic of A, B, C, D: assumptions, how we think; boundaries, the structures of our world; comfort, how we feel; and dynamics, the practices that we do that are more fluid and changing over time. And I, if anybody picks up the book, you'll see we designed this framework to be 2 axes with assumptions and comfort, our mindsets and our emotions on one of those. And that axis is about, how do we shift as an individual? How do we shift the way we think about things? How do we shift the way we feel about things so we can approach more both and thinking? So for example, as a basic practice on the thinking side, we say, look, an entry point practice is to notice how often we ask questions as an either or, and simply change the question and see what that does to invite in more creativity in the question. So how often is it that we ask questions? Should I be focused on a more depth of product strategy or breadth of expansion into new products? Or should I be more focused on global integration where there is a way in which we are all doing the same thing the same way across the organization, or local distinctions. We have unique ways that we do things in each. And if we just change the question, how can I create this global integration where we have a unified way of approaching the market or a unified way of approaching our manufacturing, and enable local distinctions and local, unique tweaks that's appropriate to, that shifts the way that we think about the question. So on the assumptions, so there's a piece about let me just step back there. So changing the question is sort of a key to managing both and an early step in noticing the questions we ask and shifting them. And that's sort of the entry level point at the individual level. And the boundaries and dynamics, B and D, the boundaries is about the structures and the context around us. Dynamics is about the practices. That's about the situation and constantly revisiting the situation. So there are both entry level welcoming practices that are about walking into this and getting started. And there's a deeper level of constantly creating the conditions around us that enable us and our teams and our companies to embed a deeper both and.
Yep. I'm a big fan of a framework, and it's a quite an integrative framework, but also very flexible and easy to digest. And you introduce it pretty early in the book, so you kind of get to see where you're headed with the application, with the ideas in digesting the book along the way. So I can appreciate that quite a bit. In terms of building a practice around this, let me tie it back to problem solving. So the solution space, right? Finding solutions to things, that part seems very, very obvious. So finding new solutions that didn't exist because we were over constrained. But if we build an overly simple model of problem solving, we have to frame the problem. We have to understand the problem, understand current reality, and then we have to get to the solution. And you said a couple of things in there, including things about boundaries that seem to tie a lot into framing the problem, including asking the question as well. And so, are there some tips before people get into problem solving, the doorway being framing the problem? How can they improve their framing in a way that increases their probability of using both and thinking as they move forward?
Yeah, I love that you framed it that way. One of our chapters in the end of the book is how do you use both and in decision making? And we have a decision making framework that is set up exactly as you just set it out, these 3 stages. And actually, if anybody wants, we have free resources up on our website that has this decision making framework that's accessible to walk through. And exactly that, we invite people at those 3 stages: frame, understand, we use the word analyze, and what's the outcome, the solution space. We invite a shift from the either or mindset into the both and mindset at each of these. So in the frame, it's exactly what we were just talking about, what you just said, is noticing how we ask the questions, frame the problem in should we do A or B mode, and simply shifting the question into a how can we accommodate A and B over time. And we actually have a whole lot of research that shows that just asking a different question opens up all kinds of new solutions and invites more creativity and more possibility. So that's the shift there. In the understanding or analysis space, what we find is that the traditional either or analysis space looks like, let's break down the alternative outcomes and do a deep dive. We call it separating or, pulling apart pros and cons, etc., and analyzing these alternatives, seeing them in conflict or, seeing them in, not conflict, but in comparison with one another in service of the outcome. In the traditional spaces, figuring out what the right choice is. What's the right choice? In the both and space, what we find, and again, this was some research that I did, like one of my very first research projects when I was studying innovation at IBM and their top management teams innovating at IBM. what we find is what we call, instead of separating and analyzing, separating in order to choose, we find that it is a process of what we call separating and connecting. And what we and in academic ease, we call it differentiating and integrating. And what we mean by that is that we still need to identify the alternative solutions or the alternative options. So if we're making a choice, a strategic choice about reinvesting in an existing product line or innovating, we still want to do a deep dive. Like, what is it about the existing world and our current customers that we really value, and understanding that deeply? And what is it that we need to do in order to innovate? Why do we want to innovate? And understanding that deeply, pros and cons, same way that we've done with our either or mindset. But instead of just stopping there in order to choose, we want to use that in order to find, okay, now where are the connections? Where are the places in which we can value both of these and connect them over time? And if I can just say one more piece, which is to unpack, because I think this is, for me, what I have heard from people when I've done workshops is that a key is that, okay, well, now how do we think about the outcome space, the solution space? Because in our traditional either or thinking, typically the solution space is, okay, which choice do we make? What's the solution? Which one of these alternative options that we have evaluated do we pick? In both and thinking, the solution space, we talk about it in two different modes, two different ways. One solution space is, well, actually, we can find what we call a creative integration. There is a win-win. There is like most people, when they think about both and, they think, oh, there's this perfect creative, integration. We use the metaphor of a mule because the mule is the oldest living hybrid that man has been bringing together, that is stronger than a horse and smarter than a donkey. You bring them together, you have a better, stronger, smarter animal. Like that, there is a both and. And when I started this study, for example, at IBM, and I was looking at, well, how do they navigate these tensions that they experience between their existing product and their innovation, which are ongoing challenges for anybody navigating change. And frankly, Jamie, as we know, everybody's facing ongoing change at this moment in our hyper change oriented world, right? So the today and the tomorrow, the existing and the innovation. What I found was that I had expected that IBM was confronting all of these decisions. How do I allocate my resources? How do I allocate HR and my people? How do I think about the structure of my senior team to navigate this like tension between the existing and the innovating? And I expected them to find all these ways where there was this like idea synergy between the existing and the innovative, this ideal mule, as we call it. And that didn't happen. Or I'll say it differently, that happened sometimes. What happened more of the time for the great IBM leaders who were really building these very robust, rigorous organizations that were able to accommodate the today and the tomorrow, is that they did what we called tightrope walking, or the metaphor we use is tightrope walking, and we call it being consistently inconsistent. And here's what we mean. What we mean is that over time, if you bring time into account, the leaders were looking out into the broad horizon and really wanting to support both their existing businesses, their millions of dollars of existing customers, and they wanted to innovate. And they had to still make decisions. Well, how am I going to allocate my sales team? How am I going to allocate the limited resources I have for my, engineering, R&D team? And what they did was that the business leaders that were not able to do this well, what they would do is they would say, look, I can't do both. It's too hard to do both. I can't do everything. So they would throw, 90% of their attention, time, resources into one or the other. Like, we're just going to be an innovative team and that's it. The ones who did this well said, look, we've got to do both, but we're going to make these micro shifts over time, these micro oscillations. And so sometimes more resources went into the today, and sometimes they went more into the tomorrow. But over time, they were able to accommodate both and then see the synergies between them. Mm-hmm. Well, we call it tightrope walking because you can imagine a person on a tightrope, they're going to move to the end. They're never fully balanced on the tightrope. It's not like they've hit the right mark and they're always balancing to move forward. They're and they're not then, and so they're shifting left and right. They're not over shifting to one side and they're falling off. They're sort of making these micro tweaks along the way, which is hard to do because it means that you have to establish a pretty overarching vision of what you want to accomplish and enable these sort of competing demands, these difficult discussions, these, productive debates to be happening so that you're constantly shifting. But that led to a much more robust long-term strategy.
Yeah. It reminds me of, and if you're tightrope walking, it's very uncomfortable, right? Yes. You're in a state of tension, and it kind of reminds me of Peter Fritz's teaching around creative tension, because it's that tension that leads to the creative path forward, but you can't get there if you're not uncomfortable. And so being in that tightrope situation is where you can perform very, very well from that aspect. So that's a fantastic explanation, and really gets into some of where we started, which is the integration of both the technique, but also some of the psychological challenges you face being in those states and doing that work. So that ties it all together. I have one last quick question for you before we wrap up. This is a book that it stands out in a lot of ways. There's not a lot of other books you read where it's like, oh, that's a different take on a similar subject. It's really a unique book in a lot of ways. Since you've written it, has there been any surprises about what feedback you've gotten, whether it's questions or ideas or reactions?
I mean, truly, it's a bit surprising in that how excited people are to read this, because how much it speaks to their experience and normalizes the tensions they experience. And it's partially surprising because when I started writing about this years ago, people said to me, like, don't use the word paradox for what we academics call the real people out there, because it's just too abstract. And not only that, but often when I will do workshops, I'll ask people, give me your emotional reaction to the word paradox. And a lot of people, oh, yuck, bad. And we use the word paradox as a normalization of the tensions and an invitation. And the fact that there is just so much more language around leaders needing to live into paradox. There's so much more language about having to lean into the both and, about the value and critical role of being in the productive debates and productive discourse, is really inspiring to me.
Love it. And although I can't hear the word paradox and not start singing a song from Pirates of Penzance in my head. So, but appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you coming on here to talk about it. I certainly encourage people to pick it up, whether it's to improve their decision-making, their problem-solving, their team, their strategy. I think it's a core set of skills to be able to operate in the world moving forward. So thank you very much, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the People Solve Problems podcast. Let's keep the conversation going. Visit jflinch.com for more episodes and other content. And continue to join us on your podcast app, of course. We greatly appreciate your feedback through reviews and ratings. Consider expanding your understanding of problem solving with Jamie's book, People Solve Problems: The Power of Every Person, Every Day, Every Problem. Available on Amazon. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and solving problems.